Hello everyone, and welcome to the next video in the series on Bobby Fischer's 60 memorable games. This time we're going to look at a game he played in 1960 at the Leipzig Olympiad against the famous Hungarian grandmaster Laszlo Szabo, who was at his peak a world title contender. It's an instructive game, especially if you're a King's Indian defense player, as Fischer provides some detailed analysis on the opening. Szabo had the white pieces anyway and opened with d4, to which Fischer answered knight f6, going into his favourite defence to d4, the King's Indian. So c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, castles, and bishop g5, which is the Averbach variation, named after the Russian GM Yuri Averbach. The main idea is to stop black from playing e5 immediately, but it's not the strongest way for white to play the opening because it gives black a choice of good ways to develop his pieces for active play. Fischer continued with d6, opening a route for his light square bishop and preparing to challenge white's centre with e5 or c5 as standard in the King's Indian defence. Szabo now made a move that Fischer considered inferior with queen d2. He thought bishop e2 and continuing development as a whole was better. This move is preparing maybe bishop h6 and exchanging off the fianchetto bishop. However, especially in King's Indian structures, this is generally a waste of time. Black will often play e5 in the King's Indian, and his bishop can for some time be hemmed in by its own pawns, so black's often happy to see it traded off like this, and the idea that it will weaken black's king's position, losing this fianchetto bishop, is illusory, really. I've been playing the King's Indian for years and it's never been a problem for me. More important is the loss of time it takes for white to set up this maneuver, during which time black can use the tempi as he pleases, setting up a stronger centre or what you will. If, on the other hand, white manages somehow to trade a knight for the fianchetto bishop, then he's doing well if he still has his dark square bishop and black doesn't have one. Occasionally it's even worth letting this rook fall in order to trade this off and keep the dark squared bishop. But it requires good positional judgment to do that. Anyway, back to the game. Fischer now struck at Szabo's centre with c5, and he answered with the best move, d5, gaining space. If instead knight f3, then c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, gives black equality already. And alternatively, if d takes c5, then d takes c5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8. And if e5, then knight g4 discovers two attackers on the e pawn. And if f4 to defend it, then f6 is good for black. Or knight e3, threatening knight c2 check, and black has a good advantage. So d5. Now e6 and bishop d3. If instead d takes e6, then bishop takes e6, and one line goes knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, bishop g4, castles, rook e8, and queen f4, defending the e-pawn whilst maintaining pressure on d6. But now bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, knight d4, rook a d1, and rook e5 leads to equality for black. He's given up the bishop pair, but his grip on the central dark squares, and in particular his knight here on d4, compensate him well enough for that. So, bishop d3. And now e takes d5 from Fischer, who writes here, white has no advantageous way to recapture. Szabo did so with the knight, which is probably best. Knight takes d5. And Fischer gives analysis on the alternatives. If e takes d5, then knight b d7, threatening knight e5, which is going to be strong. So if f4 in order to stop that, then h6, bishop h4, and rook e8 check. Knight g e2 is the best defensive move, and now to surprise, knight e4, allowing the queen to be taken. In fact, pretty much forcing bishop takes d8 is the best move for white. So now knight takes d2, bishop c7 is best for black, or white, sorry, applying pressure to d6 and forcing black to do something about his knight, which is challenged here. And in actual fact, there's only one course of action to save him, which is bishop takes c3, check. Oh, sorry, not check. But after b takes c3, there's knight e4, and this also defends d6. So white can win d6 with bishop takes c4, but now rook takes c4, bishop takes d6, but now knight b6, threatening bishop g4, winning a piece, and also threatening knight takes c4. The best way for white to deal with this threat is king f2, but still bishop g4 now keeps the initiative, and Fischer writes gives promising chances of winning the end game, because soon rook a e8 can be played and c4 is falling in the meantime to give white very weak remaining pawns. And another way, well, the only other way for white to recapture after e takes d5 is with c takes d5, which leads to an imbalanced Benoni type of setup. And the best way given for black to continue here is with a6, which is stopping white from using b5 for his pieces, in particular his knight, to pressurize the weak pawn d6. And it also prepares to advance the queenside pawn majority and generate initiative. And the line that Fischer now gives continues with f4, again to control e5. So now h6, bishop h4, and again knight takes e4 is good for black. And best play goes bishop takes d8, knight takes d2. It's similar to the line we just saw. Bishop c7, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight e4 is okay, because after bishop takes e4 there's rook e8, etc. And black should be better. And Fischer gives the note, in this opening variation black must play sharply. White has a space advantage, but he temporarily lags in development. So if you find yourself in this position, just remember to play sharply and aggressively, and make use of the e-file in particular. So anyway, back to the game continuation. Szabo captured with the knight, and Fischer continued with bishop e6, challenging this strong knight that's at an outpost now. And Szabo played knight e2, and now Fischer played the positionally minded bishop takes d5, so giving up the bishop pair. But the point is that white can only recapture now with a pawn, which makes the weakness at d6 not as bad, because it won't be on an open file. You know, it's notoriously weak to have a backward pawn on an open file. So after e takes d5, it's much harder for white to attack this pawn here. And again, black gives up the bishop pair, but he has good compensation in his dark square control here in the center. And this game's a good example of that dark square strategy working well. And if instead of e takes d5, c takes d5, then c4 is a good way for black to continue, making space for a knight at c5, which will be well posted there and gains a tempo on the bishop, because bishop c2 is the best move. If bishop takes c4, then knight takes e4 is good for black. So bishop c2, now knight bd7, castles, knight c5, which applies pressure to e4. It's attacked twice now, only defended once. So knight c3 to defend it, and now b5 with initiative due to the threat of b4. And if knight takes b5, then knight takes e4. So e takes d5 is what Szabo did play. Now came knight bd7, and white castled. And if he chooses to take control of e5, which is often a great square for the black pieces in the Benoni defense, by playing f4 instead of castling here, then queen e8 with the threat of knight e4 is good for black. If white tries queen c2 to stop this, add another piece controlling e4, then knight g4 with a dark square invasion and knight e3 coming next is good for black. Okay, that's the end of part 1.